If you walked into a supermarket today and looked at the thousands of different brands on the shelves, from soft drinks to detergent to breakfast cereal, you would probably feel a sense of freedom believing that you are making choices in a competitive free market where companies fight for your money. But this feeling is a carefully constructed illusion. Because if you peel back the colorful labels and follow the money upstream past the subsidiaries and the holding companies, you will eventually arrive at a single terrifying destination. Whether you buy a Coke or a Pepsi, whether you fly on a Boeing or an Airbus, whether you bank with Wells Fargo or Chase, or even whether you watch Fox News or CNN, the majority shareholder pulling the strings behind the scenes is almost always the same entity, a company that operates in the shadows of Wall Street with a power so vast it makes the Standard Oil monopoly of the 19th century look like a lemonade stand. This company is BlackRock, and it is not just a bank or a hedge fund. It is the Leviathan that swallowed the world, an economic supermassive black hole that manages over $10 trillion in assets, which is more than the GDP of every country on Earth except the United States and China. To the average citizen, BlackRock is invisible, a boring name on a retirement fund statement, but to the global elite, it is the fourth branch of government, the puppet master, that dictates the flow of capital for the entire planet. The terrifying reality is that BlackRock, along with its two smaller siblings, Vanguard and State Street, constitutes what financial analysts call the Big Three, and together they own the controlling stake in 90% of the S&P 500 companies, effectively meaning that corporate America has been monopolized by a single cartel that faces no competition and answers to no voters. But the true source of their power is not just the money, it is the machine that manages the money, a supercomputer known as Aladdin, which sits in a data center in Wenatchee, Washington, humming quietly while it monitors every single trade, every bond purchase, and every stock movement in the global economy. Aladdin, which stands for Asset Liability and Debt and Derivative Investment Network, is the central nervous system of modern capitalism, a proprietary artificial intelligence that processes risk for the world's largest banks' pension funds, and even central banks, meaning that BlackRock does not just play the game, they own the chessboard and the dice. This system sees the market faster and deeper than any human being ever could, allowing BlackRock to predict crashes, steer investments, and manipulate asset prices with a godlike omniscience that renders the concept of a free market obsolete. The question you have to ask yourself is not why you haven't heard of them, but why they prefer it that way. Because true power is not the politician shouting on the news, it is the quiet man in the room who writes the politician's checks and tells him what to say. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. Is that man a figure who has been called the Emperor of Wall Street, and who writes an annual letter to CEOs that essentially dictates the social and economic policies of the Western world, forcing companies to adopt woke ESG standards not out of morality, but as a mechanism of control? This is the story of how a failed bond trader built a shadow empire that owns your house, your job, your news, and your future, and why the rising cost of living that is crushing the middle class is not an accident, but a feature of a system designed to transfer the wealth of the many into the hands of the few. You are living in a company town, but the town is the entire planet, and the company store is the only place left to shop. To understand how BlackRock achieved this level of dominance, we have to look back at the moment the old world died, which was the financial crisis of 2008, a catastrophe that destroyed the reputation of almost every major bank on Wall Street, except one. While Lehman Brothers was collapsing and Merrill Lynch was bleeding out in the streets, Larry Fink and BlackRock were quietly positioning themselves as the adults in the room, the clean hands that could be trusted to clean up the mess. In a moment of panic, the United States government did something unprecedented, which was to essentially outsource the management of the financial crisis to a private company hiring BlackRock to manage the toxic assets of the failed banks like Bear Stearns and AIG. This was the moment the coup happened, the moment when the line between the state and the private sector was erased, because the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury were admitting that they did not have the technology or the expertise to understand the complex web of derivatives that was blowing up the economy, but BlackRock did thanks to their Aladdin system. Suddenly, Larry Fink was on the phone with the Secretary of the Treasury every single day, guiding the bailout, deciding which assets were worth saving and which should be allowed to rot, giving him an unprecedented level of insight and influence over the machinery of the U.S. government. BlackRock emerged from the ashes of 2008 not just as a winner, but as the new landlord of the American economy, having acquired Barclays Global Investors, which gave them control of the iShares ETF brand, a move that would funnel trillions of dollars of passive investment money directly into their vaults. This acquisition was the checkmate move because, as the world shifted from active stock picking to passive index investing, BlackRock became the default destination for the retirement savings of teachers, firefighters, and nurses across America, effectively turning the pension system into a massive capital hose that sprayed money wherever Larry Fink pointed it, But the power they accumulated went far beyond the stock market because as they grew, they began to exert a soft power pressure known as ESG, or environmental, social, and governance scores, which sounds like a benevolent system to encourage responsible business, but in practice functions as a social credit score for corporations. Because BlackRock owns the shares, they have the voting power to fire CEOs and board members who do not comply with their agenda, forcing companies to prioritize political narratives over profits and compelling them to adopt policies that often alienate their own customers. This is why you see massive corporations engaging in behavior that seems suicidal or out of touch with the average person, because they are not trying to please you, the customer. They are trying to please BlackRock, the shareholder who holds the gun to their head. The consolidation of corporate power is now absolute, as BlackRock owns the pharmaceutical companies that make the vaccines, the media companies that report on the vaccines, and the politicians who mandate the vaccines, creating a closed loop of conflict of interest that is technically legal but morally bankrupt. They own the defense contractors that profit from war, and the construction companies that rebuild after the war, profiting from destruction and reconstruction alike in a perpetual cycle of revenue generation. This is not a conspiracy theory buried on a dark web forum. This is the public ledger of the New York Stock Exchange, where the names of the top shareholders are listed in black and white for anyone who cares to look, but most people never look because the illusion of choice is too comforting to abandon. If owning the corporate world was not enough, BlackRock has recently turned its all-seeing eye towards the one asset that matters most to the American dream, which is the single-family home. In the wake of the pandemic, as inflation began to rise and the middle class struggled to keep their heads above water, BlackRock and other institutional investors began aggressively buying up entire neighborhoods of starter homes in cities across America, paying cash and outbidding families who needed mortgages. This is not just an investment strategy. It is a fundamental restructuring of society, a shift towards a rentership economy where the average person will never build equity or pass down generational wealth, but will instead pay rent forever to a faceless landlord that operates from a skyscraper in Manhattan. The terrifying slogan, "You will own nothing, and you will be happy," which originated from the World Economic Forum, is being operationalized by BlackRock's housing strategy, which treats shelter not as a human necessity, but as a yield-bearing asset class to be squeezed for maximum efficiency. By restricting the supply of homes and driving prices up to impossible levels, they are creating a permanent underclass of renters who are dependent on the corporate state for their survival, trapping them in a cycle of servitude that is difficult to break. Meanwhile, the Aladdin supercomputer continues to grow smarter, fed by the data of trillions of transactions, learning the behavior of the market and the psychology of the masses, creating a feedback loop where the machine directs the market and the market feeds the machine. There are those who argue that BlackRock is simply a passive asset manager, that they are just holding the money for grandmas and grandpas, and that they do not intervene in the companies they own. But this is a naive interpretation of power because when you are the 800-pound gorilla in the room, you do not need to shout to get your way, you just need to clear your throat. The danger of BlackRock is not necessarily that they are evil villains twirling mustaches, but that they have centralized so much risk and so much power into a single point of failure that if they were to ever collapse, they would take the entire civilization down with them. They have become too big to fail, too big to jail, and too big to exist in a healthy democracy, yet they operate with less oversight than a local credit union, shielding themselves behind the complexity of finance. As we move further into the 21st century, the battle is no longer between nations or ideologies, but between the individual and the algorithm, between the citizen and the asset manager. The rise of BlackRock represents the final victory of financialization over humanity, a world where everything has a price but nothing has value, and where the destiny of nations is decided not by ballots, but by the rebalancing of a portfolio. The Shadow Monarch has ascended the throne, and while we were busy fighting over left and right, they quietly bought the entire stadium, the teams, the referees, and the broadcast rights, leaving us as mere spectators in a game that was rigged before we were even born. The question now is not how to stop them, but whether it is already too late to unplug the machine that has learned to feed itself on the dreams of a generation.